What's up, everybody? My name is Paddock, and today I'm going to show you 4 ways to develop fast and clean technique. If this is your first time here or you've watched a few of my videos, I'd really appreciate it if you would subscribe to my channel, give me a thumbs up, and hit the bell so you get notifications for when I post new videos. Today, we are going to talk about something that you should be practicing on a regular basis, and this will have a huge impact on the way everything you play sounds, and that is technique. Technique is super important to practice, and it can make everything that you play on your instrument sound a whole lot better, because the more you practice technique, the less you have to think about the notes that you're going to play. So today, I'm going to show you some effective ways to practice technique that is going to take your saxophone playing to an entirely different level if you follow them step by step. A basic explanation about what technique is would be the ability to play fast and clean and even on your saxophone. So when we're practicing technique, we're practicing fingers a lot. Of course, you're going to be practicing your articulations and your tongue position and all that kind of stuff too, but we're really zeroing in on getting those fingers moving fast and clean. And when we're talking about technique, clean is always more important than fast. So what does that mean? So if we want to play clean, we want to play. All of those notes were really even. When we're talking about clean technique, we're talking about being able to move your fingers really efficiently and effectively and playing clean and even. If you're not playing with good technique, that same exercise might sound like this. So I was kind of playing the right notes, but the tempo was shifting back and forth. When we're talking about technique, we want that tempo to be really clean, we want your fingers moving really efficiently, and we want everything to sound really effortless. So let's talk about how to approach practicing technique. The first thing is with your scales. The scales are your musical alphabet, and the better you know your alphabet, the easier it's going to be to speak the language. So a great first place to start practicing your technique is with your scales. So if you haven't learned all of your major scales yet, that is a really good place to start. I've done a few videos on easy and efficient ways to learn them, so check that out. Or if you'd like to learn them step by step with me, you could join my sax school. I teach that in the early intermediate section. Now, when I'm talking about scales, we start off with just the major scales, but you can do this technique practice with any scale that you're practicing. So you can do it with major scales, Mixolydian scales, Dorian minor scales, natural minor scales, any scale that you're practicing, you can use the same technique practices with. So once you've learned your scales and you're fairly comfortable with them, what you want to do is get out your metronome. When it comes to practicing technique, the metronome is your best friend. You should be using it about 75% of the time. Maybe not all of the time, because you don't want to completely rely on your metronome, but this will keep you honest and it'll help you lock in your time and let you know when you're out of time. And it's also very effective to help you figure out what your tempos are and push them forward. So the way to practice with a metronome is put it on, find your comfortable tempo where you can play the scale. I'm going to do a D scale. I'm going to put it at a comfortable tempo and listen to how locked in this scale sounds. So your first step is finding that comfortable tempo. Lock it in at that tempo. Notice that my scale was really clean and even. It wasn't. I wasn't playing like that. I was completely locked in. I had the metronome set and I was playing eighth notes. So once you find your comfortable tempo, that one was 150 beats per minute. You want to bump that tempo up a little bit until it doesn't feel comfortable and try and lock it in. So I'm going to put it at 160 beats per minute, and I'm purposefully going to kind of not be locked in so you can hear what that sounds like. At 160, it wasn't locked in. So at 150, that is my comfortable speed. So what I would want to do is bump it up to 152, maybe 154, play it a couple times, bring it back to 150 where I know I'm comfortable, bring it back up to 154 where I might be on the edge a little bit, and keep going back and forth until 154 starts to feel really good. Once 154 feels really good, then you want to push it forward to 156, and then when 156 feels really good, up to 158, and keep pushing it back to a slower tempo where you feel really comfortable. But if you're trying to increase the speed, increase the tempo, you want to bump it up a little bit, pull it back, bump it up a little bit, pull it back until you reach your goal tempo. And once you've reached your goal tempo, then switch your goal tempo to another goal tempo, especially when you're talking about your scales. Now, I was just talking about moving the metronome up in 2-beat increments, but you could do 5 beats or 10 beats or whatever you're comfortable with is what you can move them up in. But you want to find your comfortable tempo and then push it forward, bring it back, push it forward, and bring it back. So your first step when it comes to practicing faster and cleaner technique is working on your scales. Start with your major scales, then move to mixed Lydian, then move to Dorian minor. Keep going through the scales, get them faster and cleaner. But remember, cleaner is always more important than faster. Now, once you've got your scales down, the next thing you want to think about is expanding your range. So instead of just playing your major scale from root to root, you want to expand that range and go up to the highest note on your saxophone that you're comfortable with and down to the lowest note on your saxophone that you're comfortable with. Now, this is going to be level dependent. So if you're an early intermediate saxophone player, your top note should probably be a high D and your low note should be a low C or low C sharp, depending on what is in the key signature. If you're an intermediate player, you can get that up to an F or maybe an F sharp. So you want to do your range dependent on what your playing level is, not necessarily the entire range of the saxophone until you're at that level. Now for this example, I'm going to play the D scale and I'm going to go all the way up to my high F sharp, all the way down to my B, and then back to my D. So I'm going to start on my D, go all the way up, full range up to an F sharp, all the way down, full range to a low B, and then end it back on my D. So it's going to sound like this. By doing that, I'm practicing the full range of the saxophone. So my low notes no longer are going to feel like special notes. My high notes are no longer going to feel like special notes. They're just going to be normal in the range of the saxophone notes. Now, if I was early intermediate and I was practicing the same exercise, I'd probably go up to high D and a low C sharp. So it would sound like this. So again, it's all dependent on what level you're playing at and what notes are comfortable on your saxophone. And then once I was really comfortable playing at that range, I would extend it at the high end. I would add an E and extend it at the low end and add in my B or my low B flat. So that is a really good way to work on extending the range. Do it one note at a time as opposed to trying to add all of your palm keys and all of your low notes all at once. If you do it one at a time, it's going to be a lot easier to do and your technique is going to be cleaner and faster as you're doing it. Now, of course, you want to practice all of these things with the metronome. The next technique exercise you want to work on is playing intervals. Playing intervals is great for getting your fingers used to jumping around. The first and most common exercise that you want to do for this is playing your scale in thirds. So playing my scale in thirds, if I'm doing it in the key of D, I'd go D, F sharp, so D to F sharp as a third, then start on E, G, that is a third, F sharp to A, that is a third. So it would sound like this. So I'm playing the scale in thirds instead of just going straight up and down the scale. Take a listen to the whole scale. Now you could do this with any interval. You could jump around in octaves. That's really good for getting your tongue in the right position. So no matter what level player you are, you can always use intervals to increase your technique and work on playing faster and cleaner. In my sax school, I have a technique series called the Chop Shop that runs throughout the entire school, and it is level dependent. So when you are in the early intermediate pathway, the exercises in the Chop Shop are designed for an early intermediate player. When you move on to intermediate part 1, the Chop Shop series gets a little bit harder, a little bit faster, and the range expands. When you move on to intermediate part 2, it gets even faster, it expands the range even more, we go into more difficult keys, and it just keeps increasing your technique. So if you're really interested in working on your technique and getting your fingers moving fast and clean, I'd like to invite you to check out the Scott Paddock Sax School. The last thing that we're going to talk about that can have a massive impact on improving your technique is playing scale patterns and licks. Now, when it comes to scale patterns, what we're doing is taking the major scale and playing it in a pattern as opposed to just playing from root to root. So instead of going, we take the notes in that scale and we turn it into a pattern. That is super effective because when you are playing songs or improvising or playing pretty much anything on your saxophone, even though the notes usually come from a scale, they're not in straight up and down scale-wise motion. So the easier it is for you to play scale patterns, the easier it will be to play pretty much anything that pops up in the music that you are working on. So the pattern that I just played comes right out of my Chop Shop series. This pattern starts on the 3rd degree of the scale. So if we're in the key of D, instead of starting on D, we start on D, E, F sharp. We start on the 3rd, which is F sharp. So it goes 3, 2, 1, so that'd be F sharp, E, D. And then it goes back up. So 2, 3. So it starts off 3, 2, 1, 2, 3. Which is a really common pattern in music. So I'm going 3, 2, 1, 2, 3. Then it drops back down to the 1 and goes up the scale. So that is a super common and useful scale pattern to practice. Now, when we're talking about scale patterns, we're going to do that starting on each scale degree. So I just started the pattern that was on the 3rd and that went down to the 1. So the next pattern I would do would start on the 4th and go down to the 2. So here's what it would sound like starting at the beginning. Then I would start on the 5 and go to the 3. The 6 and go to the 4. So when you put it all together, this scale pattern is written out in several different keys in the Chop Shop series. Scale patterns are super useful and they are a really good way to work on playing with faster and cleaner technique. I would suggest starting off with scale patterns, but you can also add in licks. Licks are another great way to work on your technique, and they're a little bit more interesting than scale patterns, but scale patterns are super important, so don't jump over that step. So licks are when you come up with like a musical idea that's not necessarily just based off of one scale. It could be based off of a chord progression, or it could be part of a melody, or it could be a lick that you heard in an improvised solo, or it could be something that you wrote out to practice as a lick. So here's an idea of what a lick would sound like. When you're practicing licks, you should also do them in several different keys, and your primary focus should be clean technique. When it comes to developing your technique, the first thing you want to do is get your metronome out and lock yourself in so that you are playing fast and clean. And of course, clean is always going to be more important than fast. The first thing that you want to focus on is playing your scales. Whatever scale you're working on, it could be major, mixolydian, one of your minor scales, it doesn't matter which scale it is, but you want to work on your scales and get them really clean. Once you've got them really clean, you want to expand the range of those scales. From there, you want to work on interval jumps and scale patterns. Those are going to help you be able to weave your way through the scales so you don't just have to go from root to root. And the goal all along, of course, is to play fast and clean and have your fingers locked into the time. Thanks for taking the time to check out this video. If you'd like to dive deeper into the Chop Shop series and greatly improve your technique, stop by the Scott Paddock Sax School.